In the year or so that we've had this podcast, our aim really has been to offer the specific Bloomberg perspective to the stories dominating the conversation in and out of the city. And this week, Dave, it feels, of course, that the story dominating most conversation is a conflict between Israel and Hamas.
Yes, Francine. So the Hamas attack and Israel's response are taking a heavy human toll. So this week, we wanted to focus on where we are with the diplomatic efforts to prevent an escalation in the conflict, but also to take a look at the Bloomberg economic research that really dives into how a wider war could potentially tip the world economy into recession. Welcome to In the City, Bloomberg's podcast connecting you to the conversations and the stories shaping the world of finance.
I'm Francine Lacqua with David Merritt and Allegra Stratton.
Welcome, Allegra. It's great to have you with us on today's show, and hopefully many more to come.
It's good to be here, Dave and Fran.
And also with us, our EMEA News Director, Rosalind Matheson. Roz, I know it's extremely busy for you and the team. The US president landed in Israel on Wednesday. Tensions extremely high after this explosion at a hospital in Gaza, killing hundreds of people. The blast drew condemnation from Arab governments who blamed Israel. Israel blamed the attack on a failed missile from a militant Islamic Jihad group. So what's the message that Biden actually delivered in Tel Aviv?
Well, he's there giving a message of strong support for Israel, and certainly, if anything, his comments shortly after he landed on Wednesday reinforced that.
I was deeply saddened and outraged by the explosion at the hospital in Gaza yesterday. And based on what I've seen, it appears as though it was done by the other team, not you.
So a strong statement from out the gate that he believed this attack was not caused by Israel. He said that very publicly and probably quite deliberately shortly after he got off the plane. They are providing military support in some ways to Israel, but also you can sense the growing concern from the US president and many others about what we're seeing happening inside Gaza, the humanitarian catastrophe that's happening there, but also the potential for seepage of this conflict, that it's going to spiral into the region and cause a really, truly massive catastrophe.
But Ros, regardless of Biden saying that it is not Israel's fault, that explosion in Gaza on Tuesday night has led to the cancellation of the broader summit that he was hoping to have with other Arab leaders. Are we seeing Biden's influence in question in the region if other Arab leaders are not wanting to sit around the table with him?
Well, it does make it much more complicated for the US to be able to navigate off-ramps and avoid that seepage into the region. What we do know, and they've said this quite publicly, which is a bit unusual for the US, is that they've been back-channeling with Iran on this for days, if not weeks, since it first happened, because their concern, again, is that Iran or Iran's key actor in the region, Hezbollah, gets drawn in heavily. And from there, the risk potentially is the US gets pulled in militarily. They do have a lot of assets in the region. And so does it become an issue where the US then is involved in a war it doesn't want to be militarily involved in? So we know there's a lot of back channeling going on. But as you say, that the feeling on this is so high, the intensity is there, that it's very difficult for there to be an off-ramp. And for the US to be helping negotiate that.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the context, I wonder what you think, Ros, is, the US administration was trying to pivot away from the Middle East, wasn't it? I mean, you've got Putin meeting Xi almost exactly the same time that you have Biden touching down, or maybe a few hours difference, but certainly the sort of strikingly different images when essentially, since the Obama regime, the Americans have been trying to move away from the Middle East, and that kind of sense that they're being brought back to an arena that they had been wanting to move on from.
And certainly, as you say, that very much the US not wanting to be drawn in directly to conflicts anywhere again. We saw the messy withdrawal of the US from Afghanistan. We've seen very much not sending troops directly into the conflict in Ukraine. Obviously, a high level of military support, but very much they don't want to have US troops on the ground again in these conflicts. And that's been a strong message throughout. And as you say, sort of focusing on Ukraine, very much the message that US wants to focus on China, seeing China as the growing superpower in the longer term. The serious rivalry on the planet is going to be between the US and China and the power blocks that they control. And so there's been a strong desire to focus on China. Both the economic measures, trade, investment, and strategically. And they keep getting pulled away from that into other things. And the imagery, as you said, of the Russian president in China on Wednesday, meeting with the Chinese president, Xi Jinping. They met for 3 hours on Wednesday alone, and they talked about a whole lot of international issues as well. And so what you've got is the US reluctantly coming back into affairs in the Middle East. And that's a strategy that really began under the former President Barack Obama, was continued very much by US President Donald Trump and now by Biden. And going into the election campaign in the US, it's not something they want really on their plates to be dealing with.
But Roz, if you send, and it's pretty incredible, we were looking at live images, if you send an octogenarian US president to a war zone, which is really quite incredible in itself, you're worried about escalation, and you're probably worried about serious escalation. How do they harden the message in still staying in support with Israel without actually causing this conflict to escalate?
Well, again, it just shows the level of concern, as you say. I mean, Joe Biden choosing to get on a plane and go into Israel. For a start, it's dangerous there at the moment. So it's not without risk for him entirely. So there's sort of
you've got air raid sirens going off in Tel Aviv, right?
Exactly. We had US Secretary of State Antony Blinken. He was in a shelter at one point, I think, and a US delegation of lawmakers when there were those air raid alerts. And so it actually is physically not without risk for him, and also not without political risk for him also to be making this trip. And the fact he's decided to do it shows just how concerned they are. You get almost a sense of panic in the US administration amongst the officials and what they're saying and what we're hearing about how they can contain this. Can they contain it?
Can I ask you, one of the main levers that the Americans were going to use to do the pivot, the kind of Pacific tilt, as it's known, the sort of move towards looking at China more closely and less and away from the Middle East, was going to be that Israeli-Saudi relationship, that rapprochement. One of the questions I want answering is it paused? Is it dead? Where do you think it's at?
It's absolutely paused for now. We know there's just no chance of talks happening. And that was something that the US has been pushing, as you say, really heavily for. They saw the potential to knit the region together through trade and investment. And if you connect people economically, the theory has always been you stop bad things happening because they're so connected in terms of the trade and the investment and the business that they do. And that wipes out some of the politics instead. That had been the hope. And it's just off the table for now. This is not a climate where Israel can continue any kind of conversation. It's not an environment where Saudi Arabia can continue any kind of conversation. They've made that clear, whether it's permanently on ice or just for now. But if we're talking about potential ground invasion of Gaza that goes on for many months and possibly draws in, again, other actors, then there's no way that can come back as a live conversation anytime soon.
I wanted to ask you, Roz, about the prospects for a ground invasion. Presumably, one of Biden's purposes of showing up, and the same with Olaf Scholz from Germany, is to delay that. There's, of course, a huge humanitarian crisis happening in terms of the evacuation of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. Is that tactic to delay the ground assault working, or is there a prospect whereby a ground invasion doesn't happen?
Well, that's the big question. As you say, we don't know how coordinated it is, but you do see one leader after another planning to come to Israel. And it's very difficult for Israel to start a ground war if you have the head of state of another country there at the time. So in a way, it does seem obvious that, right after the US president visits, are we going to have the leader of the UK, then the leader of France subsequently? And again, the idea being that might delay any kind of ground war. Does it put it off entirely? Unlikely. What you can see really from the rhetoric amongst the leadership of Israel is that despite what's happening in Gaza, despite the concerns about the situation there, despite the growing intensity on it in the Arab world, and also in places like Turkey as well. We're seeing protests outside Israeli establishments in those places, is that there's still very much the intent to do something amongst the Israeli leadership. They feel they have to. And this was a huge moment for Israel. Hamas coming in, kidnapping a load of Israelis, killing a bunch of civilians. This is not something that they can just let go. So there will be that obligation to do something.
Wiping Hamas off the face of the earth, I mean, that is not possible without sending troops on the ground into Gaza.
No, it's not. And so you can see that their intent for now seems to still be some kind of ground action in Gaza. How widespread that is might change as time goes on and the pressure rises on Israel over the situation in Gaza. But there's no sign at the moment that any of this is going to deter them.
But this will escalate. If we see these horrific pictures that we have seen over the last 2 weeks, it will continue to escalate. Where do we end up in 2 weeks?
It's impossible to say where we are in 2 weeks. We just don't know. We don't know when a ground war might start. We don't know how widespread it's going to be. We don't know what, if anything, can be done to contain Hezbollah and others from then reacting. I mean, if there's loads of Israeli troops occupying Gaza, that's a moment for Hezbollah to open a front on the northern part of Israel to take opportunity, perhaps, in that moment to escalate from the north. And so that's got to be a real possibility. So for now, there's no good answers or no good solutions and no good choices for anybody in any of this. And the US administration clearly knows that. Even in the US president's comments on Wednesday in Israel and beyond, they know there's no good solutions to this.
I was in Marrakesh last week for the IMF World Bank meetings. And when you speak to policymakers, when you speak to either central banks or finance ministers, they were in shell shock of what was happening in the region, but actually they didn't know how it would play out on the economy. Is it just impossible to say? We don't know if oil goes to 150. We don't know the implication for Iran. We don't know whether business confidence also changes.
Well, we absolutely can see that geopolitics is feeding into global markets, and the political risk there is rising. And we have Iran on Wednesday now calling for an oil embargo against Israel and saying that no Muslim countries should be sending oil to Israel. And we're seeing the oil market having reacted Wednesday on that. So suddenly those high sort of prices for oil are back on the table again and in the ether. And the knock-on effect of that globally, when you think about the environment we're in, with inflation still high, the idea that central banks have to keep interest rates higher for longer, the knock-on effect on the global economy could be significant from that. So certainly you're seeing markets waking up to this as a severe amount of geopolitical risk.
Bloomberg Economics this week have been asking that question of, is this the shock that will tip the world into a recession? The economic news has been very delicate for some time this year. Here in the UK, we have so far avoided a recession, but with inflation numbers out slightly higher than forecast on the back of oil prices, if that process continues, we're going to see a pretty stormy outlook for the UK economy, aren't we, if this situation isn't resolved?
Certainly we are. And as you say, the CPI numbers out of the UK on Wednesday showed that the inflation remains elevated, still way above 2%. And even if it doesn't change the immediate outlook for interest rates in the UK, the messaging has to be that rates are also high for longer here. And that just means that, the impact that people are feeling, we've seen that for a while just in the cost of living, the way that people's shopping habits are changing, the pressures that they've got on things like their mortgages, none of that's going to dissipate. And so that becomes a political challenge in the UK and elsewhere for a government that's heading towards an election in the UK sometime before the end of next year.
Yeah, I mean, there's many consequences that are going to play out in the UK if it spreads and it does affect oil prices and so on. What is different, I think, about where we find ourselves now, because of course we have been dealing with Russia and Ukraine and the effect that had last winter. But the difference now is that these are, governments around the world, not just the UK, cannot afford to do that backstop anymore on people's energy bills, for instance. So they are sort of out of road in terms of their policy levers to deal with another huge increase in the cost of energy, the cost of oil, and so on. So I think there's that kind of inability to respond as they did 12 months ago and longer ago. And then clearly, as you say, it's a government coming up for an election. Rishi Sunak, who I worked for, has the pledge to halve inflation by the end of the year. I think that the view, having had a choppy summer, the view was increasingly becoming that he would probably succeed in halving that. I think that is now has a question mark.
Not so much now, right?
It has a question mark above its head. And there's innumerable other things that knock on from that. We saw wages are starting to, not grow quite as much as they had been growing. Going into an election with people feeling it is sticky.
And it also probably increases the possibility of a mistake by central bank. So if you look at what the central banks do, which is a set of data, you don't really know what kind of economy you're left with because it's the third shock after COVID, after the war in Ukraine. And so if policymakers can't read this, even geopolitics or geopolitical experts can't really read this, like what chances do central banks have?
Well, it's interesting seeing too, a lot of companies are suddenly hiring, was it chief geopolitical risk officers as well? And knowing that whatever you're in, what business you're in, if you're a central bank, a company, a government, whatever, you have to be assessing geopolitical risks across the spectrum when it comes to your policies and your economy. I mean, to your point, Allegra, I think that people in the UK tolerated higher energy prices last year in a way, and the government did help defray some of that. But there's going to be no tolerance for another round of it coming into this winter. And while the UK is less exposed to gas fluctuations because they don't import as much gas as other places, certainly you can see Russia again targeting already energy infrastructure in Ukraine and beyond, challenges again around energy pipelines. And going into winter, the reality is that no one is really sort of keen to have energy prices go up again, be it in Europe or the UK or elsewhere, in a sense of fatigue amongst the general public about it. Like, again, no government's going to be able to manage that situation. But the reality is, while we got through the last winter all right, this one could be the real tricky one.
Yeah, I think it was Jamie Dimon said last week that the world feels more dangerous now than it has done potentially for decades. And when you hear the CEO of JP Morgan say something like that, business leaders, policymakers, everyone hears that, right? And people start to take action to kind of mitigate risk or maybe sort of delay spending decisions or cut back and sort of hunker down for what could be a very, very difficult winter. And that feels like it could be something that really does tip the economy over the edge. You know, these things become a little bit self-fulfilling, don't they, in terms of confidence?
Yeah, and also it's not in a vacuum, is it, Dave? You've got that kind of that economic stress, which is already there and possibly being ratcheted up, as well as that kind of social tension now. I mean, we've all been talking this morning about kind of the experience in our lives, friends divided down the middle on you know, which country is in the right has behaved appropriately so far. Everybody listening is probably feeling that. And that is, at the moment, not the Labour leadership's position, because they are wanting to show that they are compassionate, but nonetheless different from the Jeremy Corbyn Labour Party, which was more firmly pro-Palestinian. So I think that there will be all sorts of social consequences and impacts on society in that kind of difficult, tense environment, economic environment.
Yeah, no. How do the politicians tread that line, right, to kind of to speak to those different parts of the population?
You've seen Starmer's tried to square the circle by meeting with NGOs from the Gaza Strip who have a god-awful job right now. So he's trying to be that kind of compassionate politician who is able to say that Israel has a right to defend itself, but equally, you know, meeting with people who are right now, you know, tending to and supporting and caring for Palestinians, and indeed being struck themselves because they are working in Gaza. So he's trying to tread that line. But I think as things go, I mean, right now we don't actually know what the Israeli military response will be in full. At the point at which we do, I think that probably will be quite a difficult dilemma for the Labour leadership.
And I guess always a great deal of sadness, division in societies does also makes it all more uncertain for any economic operator, right, to understand what will happen in the next 6 months. Are the next 2 weeks very crucial, Roz, in understanding some of what happens next?
They absolutely are. I mean, at some point, Israel will have to make a final decision on what it's doing here, and whether it's, you know, being delayed for a bit, it will want to take some sort of action. And so that will help crystallize, as Allegra was saying, what it means in a way, not just for Israel, but for the region and the rest of the world, be it politically, be it for society. You talked about that. We're seeing those tensions bubble up, not just in the UK, but in the US and Europe as well. Regions with strong historic sensitivities to these issues, with significant Jewish populations, but also significant Muslim populations. And we're seeing that bubble up everywhere, and protests and so on. So we should get some clarity, at least militarily, in the next week or two. Israel can't leave it that much longer. They're under pressure to act. And from there, we're just going to have to work out what those repercussions are.
Roz, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's In the City. We'll be back next week. In the meantime, if you like our show, please head on over to wherever you listen to podcasts, rate, review, and subscribe. It helps people find the show. This episode was hosted by me, Francine Lacqua, alongside David Merritt and Allegra Stratton. It was produced by Summer Sadi. Additional editing by Blake Maples. Special thanks to Rosalind Matheson.